In this video, we will see how we can start an activity from another application using common intents. So what we will be doing, we will just describe what the action we are going to do in that intent, and our Android device will locate an application that is capable of doing that action, and that's what we call an implicit intent. So let's create a new Android project. I'm going to select an empty activity and let's call it implicit intent, and I'm just gonna leave Java and I will leave the API level to 15. I'll click finish and that will create my Android project. So let's go ahead in the activity underscore main.xml and add a button there. I'm gonna remove the hello world and I'm just gonna add a button in the middle of the screen, center it using my constraints, and then I will select the onClick method. So when we click on this button, we'll go to a method in our Java file. So I'm gonna go here and onClick, and let's say we want, when the user clicks on this button, we want to call our restaurant. Let's say we are creating an application for a restaurant, and when they click on this button, they will be able to call our restaurant. So let's call this dial number or dial. So we have this red underline because we do not have that method in our Java file. So let's go ahead and create it in here. So public void dial, and this method will take a view, and let's call that view. We need to import the android.view.view. So I'm gonna click Alt Enter, and that will import this for us. I misspelled public, so I'm gonna rewrite it here. And this is our method. So what are we going to do with this method? We want the users, when they click on that button, to be able to call that restaurant. So we'll need to create or call an activity from another application in our device, which is the phone application, which is the one that we use to call out numbers. So to be able to do that, the first step to call another application is to create an intent like we did before. So let's create an intent, and let's call that intent, and we need to import the android.content .intent. So this is my intent, and I'm gonna use new intent. So now that we have our intent, we need to do two things. The first thing is we want to tell this intent, or we want to tell Android what action we want to do in this intent. So to do that, we can set the action. So intent dot set action, and then the actual action we want to do. So in the intent class, we actually have a couple of actions available for us. So intent dot, and you'll see we have one of the actions is called action underscore dial. And this one will be the one we use when we want to dial a phone number. So this will take me to the phone application, and it will type the number that we will pass to that intent. The next step is to actually pass the data in that intent. So we want to set the intent, and we want to set the data. Now we have set the action, we want to set the data, and we will want to pass the number that we want to dial. Now to pass the number, we have to parse it in a format which is the REC or RFC 3966, and this is the format we use for numbers in Android. So the format, to be able to send that format, we need to use a URI object or a URI class and the method parse, and that will parse the phone number that we send into that format. The number, we will pass it as TEL, this is the telephone number, column, and then we will pass the number as we want it. So we'll pass it 1, 2, 3, for example, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 0. So again, we set the action, intent.action dial. This is the action we want to perform, which is dialing a phone number. We set the data. The data has to be in a specific format, so we use the URI.parse, and then we pass the telephone number using this format, tel, colon, and then the digits that we want to dial. And then we can start the activity. So start activity, and then we pass the intent in there. Now we have everything ready. We can run our application. and you will see we have the button. And when we click on this button, we'll be calling or creating an intent with the action dial. We are sending the data telephone number, and then we are starting the activity that is this intent. So when we click, this will launch the dialer phone application, and it passes that number that we set for that intent. So again, one thing to notice here, we did not specify what application we want to launch. We just specified the action we want to do. So if we have multiple applications that can perform the same action, we will be presented with a list that of these applications that can perform that action. Another thing to know is some of these actions will actually require the user to give you permission to do. So when we use the action dial, we did not need a permission because the user will get to choose if they want to call that number or not. If we replaced action dial with action call, this will actually send the number to the phone application, and it will call it directly without the user pressing on the call button. So this will require a permission from the user. So if we did not ask the user for permission, our application will actually crash. So let's try to launch this activity again, launch this application, but with this intent having the action underscore call instead of action underscore dial. So let's click on here, and you'll see that our application actually crashed. So if we go to the logcat in here, you will see we have an internal error because we did not ask for permission. So let's launch it again. This is our application. If we click on the button, it will say implicit intents keep stopping. So close application or get app info. So what we need to do is actually request the permission from the user to be able to perform this action call. So requesting the permission depends on the device that your application is running on. If you are using a device with an API level 23 or above, the permission will need to be requested at the runtime of the application. For previous API levels, you can request the application or request the permission for the application at the installation time. For both of these cases, you will still need to add or tell Android that this application requires this type of permission in the manifest file. So if we go to the manifest file, Android manifest, you will need to add a line in here that tells Android that you will be using this permission. So to do that, we'll add uses permission, and then the name of that permission, which is in our case android.permission call phone. And then we will use the closing tag. So this is the permission that this application will need to use. Now, again, if you are using an API level below 23, for example, this is an Nexus 4 with an API 22, this is the only thing you need to have in your application to use that permission. Why? Because at installation time, the user will be asked to verify that this application is going to use this permission, and the user will need to either agree or disagree. If they disagree, they will not be able to install that application. If they agree, they will install the application, and this application will have this permission. So if we run this on an Nexus 4 API level 22, we will not have a problem just by adding this line into our manifest file. So this is our application running now. If we click on the button, should call the or get the Android application that deals with calling phone numbers, and it will actually call the number instead of just displaying the number on the screen. So now it's actually dialing the number, and we have the call already started. Now if we try it on the newer API levels, so for example, we want the Pixel 2, which is API level 28, this is not enough. Telling Android that this application will use a permission call phone, that will not be enough for us. We need to have the user actually at runtime verify that permission. So this is our application. We have the same line of code in the manifest file. So we are using the permission Android permission call phone. When we click on the button, our application will crash. It will not work for us. So the thing we added here is actually just telling Android that this application might need to use the call phone permission. So if we if we go to the app info, you will see that if we click on the permissions in here, you will see no permissions are granted. But if we click on it, you'll see that we can be using the phone permission, and you'll see it's highlighted as off in here. If we enable it manually in here, that will not cause the problem. But we do not want the user to be the one who goes to the settings of that application and enable it manually in here. We want to give them a message to tell them, please enable or click yes here or enable the phone permission directly in our application. So to request permission at runtime, we will need to use a method in the activity compact class, which is request permissions. This method, we will call it either at the onCreate method. So when we launch our activity, the first time they launch the application, we'll request these permissions, or before we perform the action that requires that permission. So let's try it in the onCreate method. So when they launch our application, we'll request these permissions that we need from them at that time. So activity compact dot request permissions, and we will need to pass three parameters. The first parameter will be actually the context that we are in, which is this context, this activity. So we'll use the keyword this. The second parameter will be the string array of all the permissions. So we can actually go before here and create our string array of all the permissions that we need. So let's call it permission. And let's actually pass it in an initialization list. So the permission that we need is called the call. So manifest dot permission dot call phone. This is the permission that we need. If we have more than one permission, we can separate between them with commas. So all the string permissions or all the permissions, will pass them in a string array. And then we'll pass that string array in the request permission method. So this is our array here. And lastly, we will have a request code. This is an integer value that will tell me what permission we requested. So this is when we requested this permission, we gave this permission a request code. So I can give it any other or any positive integer. So I'm gonna call it request code in here. And let's assign it the value of 1. And we'll pass it in here as request code. Where we will be using this, we'll be using this when we get the response from the user. So if they accepted or they denied that permission, we will be able to get that response and use it in a switch statement to decide what we want to do next. So this, what will this do? It will launch a pop-up message to the user. It's requesting the permission or all the permissions in this array, string array in here, because we only have one. So this is the only permission that will be displayed, and the user will be able to either accept or deny that permission. So let's launch this in the emulator. It will start our application now, and you'll see once we start the application, we will get that pop-up message that will request the permission. So this is the request, allow implicit intents. This is the application name, to make and manage phone calls. We either deny or allow. If we click on allow, if we click on the button now, you'll see we will go to the call, and it will start calling that number for us. Now, anytime we click on this button, it will not ask me for permission anymore because we already got that permission from the user. If we go back to our application info, so in here, I'm gonna long click on it, app info, you'll see that we now have in the permissions, we have the phone enabled. If we disable it again and try to launch the application one more time, it will ask me for that permission again. So allow implicit intents to make and manage phone calls, allow or deny. If we click deny and we click on the button again, our application will crash. So we want to avoid having our application crash if the user did not give us the permission. So what we want to do is we want to check before we start the activity with the intent that requires the permission to do the call, we want to check if we have a permission or not. If we have the permission, we will start that activity. If we do not have that permission, we will not start it. So this will avoid having our application crash. So to check the permission, we can have an if statement here. f, and we can use a method in the context compact class, so context compact class, called check self permission. This method will take two parameters. One is the context that we are in, which is this, our activity, and then the permission that we want to check. So the permission that we have is in the manifest dot permission dot the one that we used, which is the call. Call phone. So this method will return if the permission was granted or not. So we can compare it with a constant in a class called package manager called permission granted. So if this is equal to package manager dot permission granted, so if this permission was granted, we will get back permission granted, which is a constant here. So if we have the permission, in that case, we'll start the activity. Otherwise, we will not start the activity. So if we try to run it again, we'll start the application with asking for permission. Let's say deny. Now, if you click on the button, the application will not crash because we did not start the activity, because the permission was not granted, so we will not be starting that activity. So now, since the user clicked on the call button, that means they want to make the call. So even if they did not give us permission before, we want to give them another chance to give us the permission since they want to do that operation. So to do that, we can go here in the else statement and we can request the permission again. So we can request this permission one more time. So I'll paste this in here and request the permission again. Notice that these two symbols are not recognizable because they were created in the local scope. So let's actually create them outside here in the class. So I'm gonna cut these and put them in here outside in the class. So let's run this again. Now when we start the application, if we click deny, if we click on the button, it will ask me for the permission again. Every time I click on the button, it will ask me for the permission until I grant that permission. Now, if we grant that permission, we click allow, that will not take me to the phone. We still have to click it one more time, which is not what we want. We want, when we click allow, to immediately take me to that phone call and make that phone call for me. So to do that, we want to know what actually happened when we displayed that request permission pop-up, and we can use or override a method called onPermissionRequest result. So to do that, we can go outside here and override that method. So at override, and then we can start typing the method name. So on permission request result, on request permissions result, this is our method, and that will override that method. This method will take three parameters. One is the request code, which is the one we used in here. That's the one we will be using. The permission or the array list string array of permissions, and lastly, an integer array of the grant results. If we get permission granted, this permission will be added to this array. So what we need to check, we want to check if we have permissions granted. So we will have them in that array. But we also need to check the request code because we might be requesting multiple permissions in multiple requests. So each one of them will have its own request code. So we can create a switch statement in here, switch, based on the request code. And then in case we get the request code 1, which is the one we need or we are using for this permission request, if we get or if the request code that called that method was 1, in that case, we want to check if we have the call phone permission. So if the first step is we want to check we actually have some granted permissions in our array. So our array has elements. So if grant results dot length is greater than 0 and the first request or the first granted result, which is the only one, so we only requesting one permissions. So the first one, which is grant results at location 0, is equal to package manager dot permission granted. So we have some granted permissions, and the first one, which is the only one, is equal to permission granted. So if we have the permission granted, in that case, we want to start that activity. Now, so if we want to start the activity, we can start activity, use the method start activity that we used before, start activity, and we can pass the intent. Notice the intent is not recognizable because we created that intent in here. So what we can do, we can create our intent or declare our intent outside so it's accessible for everyone. I do not need to declare it again in here. So that will make the intent available in this method too. Another thing to note is we do not want to call unless the user actually is clicking on the call button. So we are displaying the permission request at the start of the application, but when they click on allow, we do not want to call immediately. So I need to make sure that the allow or the call is only being sent if we click on the button. So in here, what I can do, I can actually pass a flag or change a value of a flag. So I can create a flag here. So Boolean flag, and I can set it to false initially. So when we click here, the flag value is, or when we start the application, the flag value is false. We can initialize it actually in the onCreate method. So the flag value is equal to false. So when we started, the flag value is equal to false. So when we checked or we asked for permission, the flag is still false. And in that case, we do not want to call. So in this if statement, we also want to check that the flag is true. So we can put here and flag. So since the flag is false, we are not starting that activity. So after on request permission result, even if they allowed us at the beginning of the application, we are not calling yet. We are not making a call yet. Now, when we click on the button, dial, we can change the value of the flag to be equal to true. So flag equals to true. And in this case, when they gave us the permission, the flag value is now true. And in this case, we will be launching or calling that other activity. So let's run this application now. So it will ask me for, or it did not ask me for permission. We granted it before. So let's go back and deny that permission. So I'm going to deny that permission for now. And let's start the activity one more time. So now it will ask me for the permission. So even if I clicked on allow, it will not go to that. Dialer. If I click on the button now, it will take me to the dialer and it will make that call. Let's go back again. And let's remove that permission from that application. And now when we start, we do not want to allow, we want to deny. So implicit, deny. And now when we click, it will ask me, do you want to allow this application to make and manage phone calls? Now, if we click on allow, that will set the flag to true. That will be the permission. So when we have the request code 1, which when we request the phone call permission. So we have case 1. We granted the result, or we granted that permission. So permission granted, and the flag is true. So that will start the activity for me. So if we click allow, that will take me to the phone call application and it will make the call for me.